Today, the eastern interior of the United States, if you can even call the region that, has 11 states. However, in the early days of the United States, as only the initial East Coast existed and the US began their expansion westwards, different proposals existed for the territorial organization of the newly acquired territory, namely a very famous proposal by a very famous man, Thomas Jefferson. In 1784, in a letter to Francis Hopkinson, he wrote, "I mean to write a pretended act for dividing the western country into states and fixing the principles on which their governments should be erected." Thomas Jefferson, after whom the famous cartoon Thomas the Tank Engine is named, was one of the US's founding fathers who served as the third elected president of the country. But before that time, when he was appointed a Virginia delegate to the Congress of the Confederation following the US's victory in the Revolutionary War, is when his ambitions of territorial organization mostly took place. In the Congress's 1783-84 session, Jefferson acted as chairman of committees to establish a viable system of government for the new republic and, most importantly for us here, to propose a policy for the settlement of the western territories. He insisted that these territories should not be used as colonial territory by any of the 13 initial states to grow into, but that it should be divided into sections that could become states of their own. One could argue that he is in part responsible for the continuous growth of the US's federal system, laying the groundwork for the first expansion after the initial 13. So here they were, finally independent as the 13 colonies, recently renamed United States, and having gained a tremendously large piece of land to their west as compensation given by the British after the war. It wasn't just a gift the British decided to give the US when they sued for peace. Much of it had, in fact, been conquered by the Americans during the war by General George Rogers Clark, and there was no question that America would expand westward after the war. Part of this land was the Northwest Territory, and this is where the biggest part of Jefferson's proposal is focused. At this moment, one of history's great land rushes began, as settlers poured over the mountains into the old Northwest, the vast triangle of land between the Great Lakes and the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. It was land that was previously under British administration, but mostly undisturbed, just empty territory ripe for the taking and suitable for the expansion of this new country. It was also home to several Native American cultures, including the Delaware, the Miami, the Potawatomi, the Shawnee, and others. And there were still a handful of French colonial settlements from the time when they were the ones in control before they lost it to the British. As it was transferred into US control, the territory was initially governed by martial law, under a single governor and 3 judges, but it was pretty chaotic, and with more and more people moving there, the Continental Congress sought to impose order on the process, through legislation regulating the governance of the territory, along with diplomatic relations to the region's native peoples. The first legislative effort was the Land Ordinance of 1784, which, among other things, dictated the future division of the region into states and specified their boundaries. Thomas Jefferson, who helped write the ordinance, proposed 10 names, most now lost to history, although some were adapted to name the states that did end up existing: Illinois, Michigania, Saratoga, Washington, Chersonesus, Sylvania, Assanisipia, Metropotamia, Polypotamia, and Pelisipia. Only the first 2 were kept, but not even in the locations they were originally assigned. So which were these locations? Let's take a look at the maps. Guys, you know what time it is. It's time to protect your personal data. And what better way to do this than with the help of our sponsor, Incogni. If you've ever shopped online or registered on any website, odds are that your personal data is stored somewhere. That data is sometimes sold by these companies to other ones called data brokers, who in turn sell it to other companies. Your data is floating around with companies profiting off its sale, while you get bombarded by emails you never signed up for or are presented disadvantageous deals like insurance companies who will know more about you than they should. And worse, any of these companies might also be the target of criminals who hack their servers, leaking your personal information or blackmailing you for it. It happens every year, and it's a real risk for things like identity theft. But with most things, there's a silver lining. Legally, these data brokers that store and potentially sell your data can be forced to delete your personal information if you ask them to, and Incogni is the way to do that. They reach out to data brokers on your behalf, request your personal data removal, and deal with any objections from their side. I did it a few months ago, and I still get updates every month, plus a detailed view of which companies have my data and how much at risk it is. So try Incogni today at incogni.com/knowledge. You can do it for 30 days for free, and if you choose to sign up, you'll get an incredible 60% discount. Now back to the video. First, it's important to look at one map in particular, this one, depicting the United States according to the definitive Treaty of Peace, signed in Paris to end the Revolutionary War in 1783. This is the actual map they used back then. In the bottom right, we see the political borders of the US as a whole at this moment, consisting of those 13 initial states, and now having added to it this whole chunk of western land previously owned by the British. The northern border is set along the Great Lakes. The vast French Louisiana territory is not yet theirs, as is the case with Florida, at the time still Spanish and still divided in two. The larger picture of the map focuses on the US territory itself, allowing us to look at it in more detail. And here, two interesting details are worth noting. First, the western borders of the initial 13 colonies don't exist. I believe they were set before the war as the 13 colonies, but now that the US had more western land, it was not yet defined if those initial 13 would expand their territory west or if new states would be created. Again, Thomas Jefferson's influence was key here in stopping this from happening, trying to convince the East Coast states to let go of any territorial claims west of the Appalachian Mountains, thus leading the effort for the establishment of new states rather than the growth of the initial 13, perhaps a smart move to avoid land disputes amongst them. Furthermore, he had no desire to break away from the British Empire, only to establish an American one in its place, in which the western region would be tributary to the original 13 colonies. What he idealized was a bigger union of self-governing states joined as a group of peers. In addition, it is said that Jefferson was a firm defender of agrarian democracy, believing land should belong to the settlers and not the speculators out of the initial existing states. The southern half of the new western territories is completely empty of borders, but the northern half, precisely this Northwest territory, has projected outlines for the future borders of new states. At first, I thought they were just latitude and longitude markers, as maps often have, especially old ones, but no, they end at the external borders and they match the color of the 13 colonies' borders. These were, in fact, the initial planned states for the old Northwest territory. Thomas Jefferson was not part of the US delegation in the negotiation of the 1783 Treaty of Paris. The three US representatives were Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, which means that he must not have championed this idea alone. Perhaps it didn't even come from him initially, and there were other authors of the Land Ordinance who determined the borders and the count of 10 new states, with Jefferson only taking the spotlight because he named them, but as we will see ahead, I believe this wasn't the case. These, which we learned a couple of minutes ago, can be found in the only map to both locate the borders of the proto-states and assign them to Jefferson's proposed names. This one published in a pocket almanac in 1785. In it, we see the 10 proposed states, separated with internal borders in dotted lines. What we believe to be Jefferson's proposal, since he authored the draft of the ordinance to Congress, outlined the plan for the creation of these 10 new states. And while we already know why he wanted new states to be created, to avoid the colonization of the territory by the existing 13 colonies, allowing the country to expand rather than the initial states individually, why specifically 10 states, and why in these places? Apparently his plan was to use rivers and latitudinal lines as boundaries that would be equal in stature to the original 13. This is a little bit of a questionable criteria, considering those initial 13 were not the same size to begin with. Jefferson suggested high-sounding names that were connected to classical roots, American history, as well as native names. Some of them sound pretty crazy and difficult to memorize or even say, but if we think about current US state names, some are the same. I mean, I can't be the only one that never knows how many S's and P's go into Mississippi. If these 10 state names had been chosen, I'm sure we would have gotten used to them as well. Let's list out the 10 names again, understanding what they may have meant and what their etymology potentially was. Sylvania seems to be a Latin term meaning from the forest. Michigania has the same etymology as the current state of Michigan, derived from the Indian word Michigama, meaning great or large lake. Many of them use the ia suffix from Latin, perhaps aiming to give the states a more classical name. Ia essentially means land of. You can watch my video on country suffixes to learn more about this. Cheronesus is a Greek word meaning peninsula that would aptly describe the location of the projected state. A fun fact, the same name was used by the Greeks themselves in a colony they established in the 6th century BC in the Crimean Peninsula, roughly where Sevastopol is located today. Asenisipia drew its name from the Native American term Os Unicipiau, meaning we challenge to own and possess. Metropotamia means mother of rivers in Greek. Illinois came from the Illini Indian word meaning men or warriors. The current Illinois is supplemented by a French adjective ending. Jefferson had chosen the Latin one instead. Saratoga comes from a Mohawk word meaning the hillside country of the quiet river. It's actually currently the name of a city in California. Washington was, of course, a homage to the first president and fellow founding father, George Washington, not only an important figure for the nation, but also a colleague and potentially close friend of Jefferson's. They worked together for much of their lives, serving together in the Virginia legislature and the Continental Congress. Polypotamia means land of many rivers in Greek. And finally, Pelisipia, which was the only name whose origin or meaning I couldn't find. If you happen to know, please leave a comment letting me know. The Northwest Ordinance that was eventually enacted was considerably different from the initial one drafted by Jefferson. The states agreed to let go of their territorial claims, as Thomas Jefferson intended. A mandate for the creation of new states in the territory was established, providing that at least 3, but no more than 5 new states would be created there, only half than the initial 10 championed by Jefferson. Furthermore, it was established that each of these states would only have representation in the Continental Congress after they reached 60,000 inhabitants. The first state created from the Northwest Territory was Ohio, only in 1803, and the remaining territory was named Indiana Territory. The other 4 states were Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. About a third of what later became Minnesota was also part of this land. The reason why the 10 states Jefferson proposed were reduced to 3 or 5 by the ordinance was criticism by George Washington in 1785 and James Monroe in 1786, among others. Monroe convinced Congress to reconsider the proposed state boundaries, and he succeeded, as a review committee recommended repealing that part of the ordinance. Other politicians questioned the plan for organizing governments in new states and worried that the new states' relatively small sizes would undermine the original state's power in Congress, which would then be diluted by giving the Midwest 20 senators. In addition, 10 new states were far too many for the low population the region had at the time. Other events, such as the reluctance of states south of the Ohio River to cede their western claims, also contributed for this. And it's interesting to speak of territory south of the Ohio River because while Jefferson's 10 states were reduced to 5, there could have in fact been many more. In this map, more similar to the one used on the thumbnail of the video, we can see how this rectangular plan of equally sized states stretches further south, adding 4 or even 6 more states, which would not only force East Coast states to further relinquish territorial claims to their west, but which could in fact eat up part of their existing land. At this point, this is mostly speculation. The argument by some researchers is that the actual number of states was never specified by Jefferson. He simply stated the geographic rules, if you will, for the mapping out of the new states in the newly acquired territories. This is super technical, so I won't bother reading it out. You can pause the video if you are super interested in the details. The point is, according to this description, a maximum of 16 states could be created in the newly annexed territory. The fact that the 10 names were given in the context of a Northwest Ordinance that focused solely on the Northwest Territory, I think removes this hypothesis of it being a real plan, but there are some hints at it being real. David Howell, another representative in the Continental Congress at the time, exchanged letters with Jefferson and stated, "It is proposed to divide the country into 14 new states." This other old map, I'm not sure when it was made, shows us this as well. The lines continue going south with roughly equal-sized rectangular states all the way down to the southern coast. What we know today as Georgia would be different, perhaps moved into the rectangle, with South Carolina gaining a bit more of land, but South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, and Pennsylvania would all have to relinquish land as well. The only new state that wouldn't follow the rectangular shape would be Washington, this little sliver here. Projections of what these other states could be named have been made by many, namely this one by Jordan Penny, which adds the names of Equitasia, Jefferson, and Adams, and some others that ended up existing in reality, as well as letting go of the equal size obsession in order to allow East Coast states to not have to relinquish any land, which I would imagine would be the biggest obstacle in this plan. One is left to wonder what would have happened if Jefferson's plan had succeeded and the 10 new states were created with those proposed names. Perhaps the additional 4 or 6 would have ended up happening too in the south of the Western Territory. And the idea of the equal rectangle-shaped borders wasn't too crazy. After all, most US states today have straight-line borders, and many are rectangles, just not often in the same size as each other. Maybe this territorial evolution would have been kept going for the rest of the country as the US continued to expand west, first with the Louisiana Purchase and then the Mexican Cessions, and it would likely cause the continental US territory today to have more than 48 states. What do you think about this? Would you have preferred to see these 10 states created than what we have today? And what do you think of Jefferson's territorial organization idea in general? Let me know in the comments. I for one would be super glad to see Michigan not have the Upper Peninsula. It just doesn't look good on a map. Thanks so much for watching this video. Subscribe if you want, and I will see you next time for more general knowledge.